this thing kicked off. We're talking about FedRAMP 20x, what's changing, and how to prepare us. So, as you heard earlier, my name is Marc Zurcher, Managing Principal with Coalfire, overseeing the public sector advisory portion of Coalfire.
Perfect. I'm Isaac Teuscher, a security engineer at Paramify. So Paramify, we're a GRC tool that we support a lot of FedRAMP clients, and I was on our security team going through our FedRAMP 20x pilots with Jordan as our auditor.
Hey guys, my name is Jordan Foster. I am with Coalfire's assessment division here. I was able to work with Paramify on their 20x pilot, also participated with a few of our other clients as well. So happy to give you all a perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll kick things off. So we'll start talking about the differences between FedRAMP Rev 5 and 20x. Jordan, you want to get us kicked off with what you've seen as some of the major differences?
Yeah, definitely. So I think you can't really talk about Rev 5 and 20x without talking about the difference between more of the manually driven compliance and what FedRAMP is expecting from automation capabilities, machine-readable output, really doing more of that persistent validation and assessment, and shifting away from what they would call screenshot-based audits that really only provide you visibility for a single point in time that become outdated the moment that report gets submitted. And so a few other areas too that we want to highlight as we look at Rev 5 versus 20x, there's some philosophy shifts when we look at, well, what's in scope, what's not in scope, what is considered a relevant asset versus what might be considered something that could be classified as out of scope. When we actually look at these, there's a few considerations. Does it handle federal customer data? That's more on your 20x side. Rev 5, we're talking about federal data, metadata. So we were bringing a lot of things into scope. You know, hey, it contains an IP address about a server that might at one point have touched federal data. That's now considered federal metadata because it could lead to the potential impact on confidentiality, integrity, availability, a lot of different facets that we had to consider when it came to scoping that ultimately brought a lot of noise to the assessment and was bringing things into scope that didn't necessarily result in a material increase in overall security posture. And so I think a few of the other points I want to highlight here, we have castle wall mentality over on the Rev 5 side. We were drawing the clearly defined red border. It's in the RAR template. It's got to be red. I think there's actually a font code that you even use for that, so yes. Red border. On the 20x side, we have a little bit more flexibility. Rather than doing that straight up red line, hard box around what is or isn't in the authorization boundary, you're taking an approach to discovering your own assets. You have some means of identifying what is, what isn't in scope, and then ultimately applying the key security indicator against those assets.
I was going to say, so Isaac, when clients are coming to you all asking questions around FedRAMP, are you seeing a big difference in what they're coming to you with when it comes to Rev 5 or 20x?
Yeah, I think the thing we've seen the most is, and one of the things that gets people excited, maybe some of you in this room are excited about this, there's no agency sponsor requirement with FedRAMP 20x. And so historically, this has been one of the real roadblocks. Yeah, the round of applause, right? That's been one of the big roadblocks. And I think it's important to note it's a roadblock both for the private companies and for the government. Like, I honestly think that probably the agency AOs dislike the agency sponsor requirement, maybe even more than the private companies do, because it's just such a burden and investment of resources from the agency perspective that oftentimes there would be cloud services that were up to the standards. They might even have a ready status and just be sitting there waiting, not used by civil servants because of this kind of agency sponsor. And so a big part of this shift from Rev 5 to 20x is moving to a more automated model so that FedRAMP can offer program certifications where the agency doesn't need to take the burden of doing that sponsorship. They still have to perform their assessment and they have to perform their authorization. We'll get into that. But that's one of the things that we're seeing a lot of people come excited for. At Paramify, we went through Rev 5, FedRAMP High. We were listed as High Ready. We had agencies that talked to us and said, we'd love to use this tool, and we still sat it ready. And so when we went through 20x, we were like, we control our own destiny. Like, we're not beholden to anyone else and kind of their timelines. We can control, we can invest, we can implement the controls, and we can see ourselves through. And so that is something that we're excited about on the private side, but also the government's excited about because it means there'll be more options in the marketplace. And so that's the other thing to understand here. When we say flexible architecture, this doesn't just mean like we're lowering the barrier from Rev 5 to 20x. What it means is we're trying to give agencies the ability to make risk-based decisions. So there may be something that doesn't make sense for one agency that makes sense for another agency. And so we're trying to let each system be transparent, be clear about what security is implemented, what decisions have been made, and then let the agency choose what's appropriate for their use case.
I think a good point there is also wanting to look at commercial parity for the tools. So back to like the castle wall mentality and the flexible architecture, you had to, for the longest time, be building a federal specific offering versus your commercial offering. And usually there was no parity between the two offerings. You had features that the government wanted to use in your commercial offering, but couldn't because of the limitations that existed within the FedRAMP Rev 5 program, that now with 20x, you should be able to bring those to market and not have any kind of disparity between the two.
Yeah, for the executive leadership in the room, FedRAMP is encouraging as much as possible for there to not be a standalone FedRAMP version of the product and just to keep the commercial version and give the evidence of the commercial version security for FedRAMP. And so some of those requirements that historically have been associated with FedRAMP, like US-based persons and things like that, there's a lot more flexibility so that each company can just focus on the core product and bring that to the federal market instead of making a copy that never then gets updated, never gets new features, never gets improved. Because we don't want our government employees using bad versions of products just because of FedRAMP.
I think it's a good segue into the concept of ensuring that the marketplace, the FedRAMP marketplace, is a more lowercase d democratic offering in which now you have, and I use this example in our webinar, all of the boxes of cereal that have been certified are now on the shelf and can be chosen by the government to be used. You're going through this process now to take your box of cereal, get it certified, ensure it meets all of the requirements that have to be met, but you're not gate-kept anymore because you don't have a sponsoring agency, because you're not necessarily meeting particular requirements, or you don't have a direct pathway to an agency that may know what your product does. Now you can go through the process, not have to worry about the agency just yet, be on the marketplace and be able to use that as a place to showcase that your product is meeting the minimum asks of what 20x is asking for and can now be procured by government services.
All right, well, I think that gives us a good segue into what we have up here right now. So when we compare the existing impact levels, or what were the different authorization levels at FedRAMP, to the new certification classes, there's a few reasons behind that. I think the first one is really just crushing some of the confusion. We have FedRAMP authorizations, agency authority to operate, ATOs, and ultimately those words were way too similar and people kind of thought of them one and the same. I'm FedRAMP authorized. That means that any agency can go and reuse me. And that wasn't the case. Each agency still has the own responsibility to go out and issue their own risk-based decision on whether or not they want to do that ATO. And now with certifications, that's designed to crush that, not only just in the name itself, but from what these actually mean. So we have Class A, Class B, Class C, Class D. A is more of your FedRAMP ready equivalent, B being low, C moderate, D high. And what each of those really mean is that there is information available to drive this, like the ultimate decision around making that ATO from an agency. And so FedRAMP's job now is, hey, we want to create a program that ensures cloud service providers are building out their security programs in alignment with what is important to their business. They're structuring that in a way that addresses the key security indicators and the different rules that exist within FedRAMP. But ultimately, we're not making any type of authorization decision on your behalf. That is still an agency responsibility, but we are going to issue a certification that then goes to say, hey, there's information here to support that process. That information has been done in alignment with what we expect. And that ultimately, when you are looking at a package at a different certification level, it's not even really designed to reflect, oh, Class C means moderate. If you're an agency that has a high use case for that workload and you're happy with what you see, cool, go issue the ATO. But Isaac, Mark, either of you have any additional perspective?
Yeah, I think this is a great point. The goal here is that different agencies could authorize the same class at different impact levels. So this is kind of what Jordan's getting at, right? But that begs the question, like, what level do we start with, right? If we're a cloud service provider and we're looking at this and we're saying, okay, I knew that most of my use cases were at moderate. Does that mean I should just default to class C? I think the approach here that FedRAMP is encouraging is that you kind of start with the lowest rung and then move up as you need to. So again, the hope is to bring down the like cost barrier so that more options can be available in the federal marketplace. And so the hope is that you could start at a class B or a class A, and then if there's an agency that needs more, then you could move up to a class C. And then if there's someone that needs more, you can move up to a class D. There's not huge lifts between these levels, but the goal is also that you can move up as you need it and not overinvest so that more companies will at least get started and get in the marketplace. And so the hope is that in the class A side, which is really kind of a FedRAMP ready or almost like a SOC 2 status, the hope is that there could be thousands of CSPs that are listed in the marketplace as class A in kind of a ready status. And then the expectation is once they get an agency customer, then let's move to class B. Then when we get maybe DHS, now let's move to class C. And so the hope here is that there's kind of a gradual progression that comes once agencies invest in your cloud service, instead of you having to invest a whole bunch of capital up front before you can even see any return on that from agency customers.
I think that leans really well into, I think Stacy had a good point earlier about your business case is constantly being refined as you're talking and understanding what agencies' requirements are. This is a perfect opportunity to be able to go in at a lower class certification level, get on the marketplace, and then evaluate what your business case looks like with these different agencies and understand what information they're really asking it for and what they need to feel comfortable in making a risk-based decision. I used an example of like if you have an app that counts trees, the Forestry Service may be perfectly fine in authorizing that at a class B or maybe even a class A. Class A is really more from like pilot type of applications and really to kind of replace the red status. But if you take that same application, Forestry Service super happy counting trees with a class B, you may have a use case with DHS where they're like, I like what your application does, but I want to count people. I want to count troop movements. I want to count missile silos, whatever it may be. They may be like, I want to see more information. So I want to see class C or class D level type of information. You can use your business case right then and there to not overinvest in the beginning and actually have that follow where your revenue pathways are going to go to. One important just dovetail to what Jordan was saying earlier, a lot of folks were kind of ornery about this because they're like, well, I got, my JAB PATO. It is the most powerful thing in the world, right? At the end of the day, a JAB PATO was still a provisional authority to operate. It was not a blanket authorization. Agencies were supposed to still, in that model, grant you an ATO individual. The only reason it had extra cachet is because of the JAB board and the folks that sat on that, and thus it gave it that additional level of cachet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Pete loves to point out that the original description of what a FedRAMP authorization was, if you read the definition, it said the FedRAMP authorization is a certification that blah, blah, blah. And so really this isn't a rework. It's just a clarification of the role of FedRAMP, which is to certify a package. The agency always and will always be the one to actually give the authorization to operate.
So we moved on to the next slide, and we're just going to kind of dive into some of the 20x principles. And I think both Isaac and Jordan, you guys kind of touched on these.
Yeah.
You guys want to dive in a little bit more into some of the KSIs and what that
yeah,
how that works?
I can start with the KSIs. So one of the big shifts that kind of caught people off guard when 20x was first announced was there's not a direct base on the NIST 853 controls. So instead we have key security indicators, which are a reduced number of security best practices, I would say, that tend to cloud native architecture designs. They're based off of the NIST 853, so there's related 853 controls, but these do not take the language, they don't take the parameters from 853. They're standalone from FedRAMP. But again, if you have implemented against 853, there's lots of crossover. It's the same kind of principles. The goal here is to reduce the number and also provide flexibility, which I think is one of the things we've already talked about and we'll keep talking about. The idea here is like, let's say you have a fully serverless architecture. So you don't have any like operating system that you maintain. Well, then a control that's specific to like an operating system requirement doesn't make sense for you. And so these key security indicators are worded in a way that is more flexible based on modern cloud native architectures.
Wait a minute. You mean that my desktop timeout isn't legit?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like, what does it look like to have, when we did our FedRAMP Rev 5 ready, we were looking at like, they're like, how can I SSH into this? And we're like, you can't SSH. There is no SSH, right? And it's like, well, there's this requirement about remote access. And it's like, so for those in the room that have gone through audits, you understand that like the controls are oftentimes more prescriptive than where modern architecture is. And so these key security indicators let FedRAMP move more quickly and map to modern architectures more than staying tied to the 853 requirements. So
yeah, and it has been brought up by the FedRAMP team that the design of the KSIs isn't intended to be a one-to-one to every single NIST control.
Yep.
You look at the moderate baseline, you have 323 controls. The KSIs notably even lack coverage for the actual physical layer of anything. So I think those MA and KP controls, those are not represented. I think there's a few mappings that exist throughout there. But by design, it was intended to address those with cloud native architecture who are running on an infrastructure stack where you're able to get some of this telemetry out to support a machine readable output. But the one thing I want to highlight is that it is very much objective focused. And so the thing we constantly see parroted throughout the community is, okay, it's going to result in everyone doing something differently. But the intent is like, okay, maybe that is the case, but the objective should be the same or similar in terms of what CSPs are building out. And then when we go about the actual process of getting to that objective, of course, that's going to look different. There's multiple ways that you can show that you are controlling network traffic in your environment, whether you do that through security groups, some type of firewall ACLs, whether you're trying to prove a negative and show that, oh, traffic isn't going to this specific destination through monitoring at your WAF, looking at event logs. There's a lot of ways to go about doing that. And so ultimately, the goal is more around build to an objective, do that in your way that works for your business, and ensure that you're leveraging some type of machine readable data that can be pulled on a continuous basis, that you're able to update so that you're not having to pull one of your engineers every time an auditor comes in or you need to prove something. And you're able to reach a state of more continuous compliance, persistent validations, and ultimately meeting some of those key 20x principles.
Yeah, you could really say it's about security outcomes. You do things all different, but at the end of the day, you're trying to get to the same security outcome and showcasing what that looks like.
Yeah. One of the things that really excites me about 20x is if you go and read like the NIST RMF, it really is baking those principles into the framework. So when we talk about like this continuous evidence, focusing on like making this not a point in time assessment, but an ongoing process, this is all coming straight from RMF methodology of like, we want to attest to the control as close to where it's running and frequently so that we have, ongoing assessment. So when we look at the difference between 20x and Rev 5, this is kind of a summary slide here. As you can see some of the changes that have been made. Marc, Jordan, anything that stands out to you that you want to highlight that we haven't covered as well yet?
Yeah, I can touch on this a little bit because I think really the intent is not to say, oh, 20x is the entirely better system, everyone go do 20x. Rev 5 still has its place. I think Rev 5 still results in strong security outcomes, as we've seen with the majority of cloud service providers that have done it for over a decade under, what was Rev 4, then Rev 5. But ultimately, we still see that it builds for strong security posture, protections around confidentiality, integrity, availability, all of that exists. But ultimately, we have different ways of getting there. Where under the Rev 5 model, we were doing point-in-time annual assessments, maybe a couple SCR assessments throughout the year here and there. The intent behind 20x is that, yes, you're still expected to work with an independent assessor, get some baseline for what your security posture looks like. But ultimately, the goal is that you're auditing yourself continuously. Like the role of the 3PAO is to make sure, come in, make sure it makes sense, that you're looking at the right things, translate some things to layman terms so that if an agency picks up your package, they know what's going on just in case things are too technical or crazy or there's just a lot going on. But ultimately, we know that agencies don't have the time to go look through a SAR package and comb through the 1,000-line SRTM to figure out what's going on everywhere. When we distill things down to the outcomes within 20x, they can more reasonably say, hey, I have time to look at 50 things. I can go review that. And so that's where we really are bridging the gap. We're focused on machine-readable output. We already have this data in our environment. We, as cloud service providers, are now just responsible for doing that additional analysis internally. The decision that our 3PAO was making, you're now creating logic to make that decision and show that to who's ever looking at consuming your product. And so that's where a lot of the rules as well come into play. You have things around authorization data sharing, collaborative conmon, vulnerability detection and response. And these are all intended to work with each other to create a bit of a circular ecosystem where you're constantly looking at your environment, assessing what's important to the business, prioritizing what's important to the business, and then showing that through these different outcomes.
Yeah, we've seen this in practice. Like now that we are 20x certified, just this week before coming out here, we was with our CISO and our CTO, and we were looking at some of our failed validators. This evidence that we're collecting through some scripts that then gets validated to make sure it's passing. And they were like, hey, that's something we actually should adjust. Like we're seeing that there's less signal to noise in 20x because you get to determine exactly how you're validating and the type of evidence, the continuous validation that you're performing. And so the benefits here are not just, faster time to the federal market, but there's also a value of that the resources you're investing as a cloud service are funneled more into the metrics and the monitoring that you care about as a business in terms of your security outcomes, which enables you to have low signal to noise where when things come up, you actually care to fix them. And so that was our CTO's feedback. He's like, this is good. Like the stuff that you're bringing up to me that comes from the alerts through 20x is things that we do want to fix and it's worth our time. So that's the value of 20x flexibility, is that it lets you control more of that investment going into things that matter for the security of your cloud service.
That one, I think even Pete has mentioned, like your dashboards should not be green lights all the time. If they are, something's probably not calibrated properly. So I think that's an excellent example of showing where, oh, hey, like things are blinking here, red and orange. We should probably take a look at that, tweak it, figure out why that's occurring.
Yeah, happy to report we haven't lost our 20x certification, even though something failed, right? So it's good.
There you go. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit through and kind of summarize what we've been talking through from the lens of how to prepare, how to audit, and how to automate. So how to prepare for 20x. So the three top things we have here is know what matters to your business. We've mentioned this a couple of times and it's been brought up throughout a lot of the sessions here. Understand what your business is, understand what your business case is, and understand whether 20x makes sense for you for the moment that you're in, for the market that you're trying to chase. Public sector civilian base, you're looking to get a splash into the marketplace, make sure folks know that you have a solution that can meet government problems and can help fix what ails us. 20x is going to be the path for you. If you've got an agency that has line of sight, they've got revenue for you and they need to meet it now, you might want to consider Ref 5 and look at the balance improvement requirements. If you're pursuing DoD, forget everything we talked about, focus solely on cloud SRG and know that DoD and the public civilian sector are very much not simpatico at the current moment, and know that you're going to have to look at something a little bit different because you're going to have to be existing within NIP or NET. You're going to have limited internet connectivity. Yeah. A lot of the concepts of 20x have not made it to the DoD land yet, but we are hearing word that they're considering what that looks like. Next, applying the actual KSI. So actually look through what level is going to make the most sense for the 20x certification class that you're looking at, and then make sure that you're applying the KSIs consistently throughout your minimum assessment scope. Understand what that looks like. Make sure you've got a good grasp of how you're going to go about taking your commercial offering and meeting what the KSIs are asking for and what that automation pipeline is going to look at. Then, as I think we heard again a couple of times, monitor and update your strategies. Your business case is going to be constantly being refined. Make sure that you're still on the right path. Make sure that what you're doing now makes sense for you. Like Isaac mentioned earlier, start off with B if that makes sense for the place on the marketplace that you're looking for, if you don't have a specific agency. But once you start hearing indicators, or I like that the signal through the noise, if you start hearing signals that, okay, I'm hearing DHS is looking for C for my particular type of service offering, start to move in that direction.
Yeah, I'll just make a comment too. I think Marc brought up a good point that today the Department of Defense war is kind of not, except there's a little bit of a question mark around the FedRAMP moderate equivalency. But the good thing here is the Department of Defense, Department of War has been moving and pushing towards this same kind of CATO, right? Continuous ATO. There's the DoD SWIFT program that really is resonating with these same principles. And so, here at Paramify, we're talking to folks over there, and we're recognizing that, like, yeah, we're using different words to describe the same kind of thing, right? Whether you call it CATO, whether you call it DoD SWIFT, whether you call it FedRAMP 20x, if you have a program that is continuously generating machine-readable evidence that you can show that demonstrates your controls are in place, like that's what we're going for. That's what it's all about. So when it comes to building for 20x, it starts with generating that machine-readable data. The format, the schema doesn't matter as much. We can always restructure or reformat it into what's needed. So I wouldn't like overly commit to OSCAL, or like sometimes people will say, should I do JSON or YAML? And it's like,
Whatever works for you.
whatever works. As long as it's structured, you can sort it into however whatever structure you need it to be. So you're looking for, like, where are we already getting telemetry? Where are we already getting data out of our systems that shows our controls are working how they should? And so oftentimes what this means is having the GRC team talk with the engineering team. And so for us, this meant having, the GRC compliance folks sit down with the engineers and understand, like, what are these stages in our CI/CD pipeline? Why do we run this test stage every time we commit code? What is that looking for? What does it fail on? And those are already artifacts that are generated through your processes that are existing, and that's what we mean by machine-readable data. Moving from there, we're building out the validation pipeline. So how are we going to collect this? How are we going to check it to know that it's sufficient? The one thing I'd say here is understand that FedRAMP 20x wants to see the full pipeline, the full story. So if you're using a tool that is kind of abstracting away that validation process, it's likely that that validation process is going to get brought into the scope of the assessment, at least to understand some visibility. There's a client we worked with who uses Wiz for a lot of these key security indicators. Wiz is an awesome tool. It does a lot of great stuff. It has great visibility. It can do a lot of checking. But they were returning reports for their FedRAMP 20x evidence that said, Wiz says we're good on this, and Wiz says we're good on this, and Wiz says we're good on this. And it's like, it's wonderful, Wiz says you're good, but how do I know as the auditor or as FedRAMP or as an agency that you've configured your Wiz properly to see all the resources? How do I know that you haven't just excluded everything? You can show me that in Wiz. It's not saying don't use Wiz. I think it's an awesome product. But you just need to understand that whatever your validation pipeline is that's producing this evidence, you need to give enough insight, enough visibility that there can be a level of trust and a level of assurance. So then lastly is just monitoring and reporting your priorities. I think we've kind of belabored this point, but again, this is, if there's things you don't care about as a business, you can just say, we don't care about this, and put it as manual evidence and not spend too much time on it. And that's okay. That's not a showstopper for FedRAMP. As long as you feel confident in your story around that to tell it to an agency, then you can stand on that.
All right, well, I definitely cannot read those without cocking my head extremely up. So I'll just go off.
Verify the relevance.
Verify the relevance.
All right, so when we talk about verifying the relevance, that's really the first point, right? We need to understand what you're looking at, why you're looking at it. The job of the independent assessor is to come in and be that translation layer between the cloud service provider, between that future agency customer, or maybe another B2B customer, to say, okay, like, we have a general idea of what Paramify might be doing to meet this specific KSI or meet this certain rule. And our job is to attempt to distill that down into a digestible format that someone can come along and understand what's going on. Because there is a lot of technical analysis that is involved with these KSIs. You're pulling in a lot of different data from different parts of your environment. We're talking about file types like JSON and YAML. And for an agency ISSO, that may not be their native language of what they're used to seeing when it comes to a risk report. And so ask the independent assessor. We want to make sure we understand the relevance. We're able to then convey that through our analysis of the KSIs. And ultimately, that's where we're bringing value to the process and working with the cloud service provider to ensure we're representing their system in the way that they want it to.
For accuracy and coverage.
All right, accuracy and coverage. So this one, again, like, when we're looking at any type of data sets, we want to make sure that the data is relevant to what the actual makeup of the system is. So when we think, oh, okay, FedRAMP inventory, we know our assets, we know what third-party vendors we use, we know the people that support our environment. Just to highlight that, FedRAMP has pushed a lot on information resources are not just machines. Your humans are also information resources. They can impact the confidentiality of data, the integrity of it, the availability. And so they're another important facet to consider when you're looking at any KSIs. It's not to say that, like, hey, bring the humans into scope every time, but you should consider, hey, where there's KSIs that are relevant to human information resources, we should be looking at different machine-readable outputs that support the evaluation of the effectiveness of those individuals and what they're doing. When we talk about access to different resources, well, maybe your HR person doesn't have logical access to the system, but they could terminate access for your developer, your SRE team, and then that could go about causing an issue to the environment. And so these are all things that as an organization, you might be considering, hey, these are areas where we can present and demonstrate risk posture, but they're not necessarily a hard requirement under the KSI. Then again, that just comes back to the philosophy of 20x. And then last bullet point.
Last is identify the gaps and recommendations.
All right. And so that's the last piece, right? So like as the 3PAO, we still want to, I'm saying 3PAO, I said it for 9 years now.
Independent assessor. Yes.
IA. As the IA, we are responsible for coming in, looking at what you're doing, saying what looks good. Like really that's part of our job. Like we want to talk about what's cool, what isn't. And in those areas where things don't look so great, being able to highlight to both yourself as the organization what the gap is, but also for an agency. Because if there's something that you deem not important and we see it as a gap, we do want to report on that. We want to give a level of visibility to drive risk determination. And then the last point is giving recommendations as well. And so you might be doing something, it might get half of the way there. You might have some good data sources, but you're really not processing them or presenting them in the right way. And so our job is also to give you those recommendations of what we think might be beneficial for you to then go and present as part of a particular KSI. And so I think through those three areas, your independent auditor is coming in, working with you, really being a collaborative partner and operating more as an ally rather than an enemy. Like we're not coming in like trying to find things that are wrong and tear your system apart. We want to come in, understand what's good, and then help you build towards ultimately being better.
And last but not least, just some efficiency metrics. So a minus 75% reduction time in time spent in interviews. So a huge amount of time cut out of the interview process. Minus 85% time, or I'm sorry, a minus 85% reduction in the types of controls. So down to 50 KSI. So a huge shift in how we're evaluating what the security metrics are. And then minus 99% in less screenshots used.
Yes.
No more screenshots, right? And then we'll end it with what I'm sure there will be plenty of questions.
Yeah.
So I can grab a microphone.
Yeah. Okay. I think this is still. Yeah, I'll be the runner.
So as a CSP who's been working with the government a long time, you have a certain amount of experience working with the government, and the experience tells me that when they use their ATOs, they're going to be doing it under Rev 5 packages. And if we go 20x, they're still going to be expecting us to have a Rev 5 package that they can inherit from. So how do you bridge that gap?
I can.
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one, Marc, and you can provide some good input here. And, I'm quoting a little bit of what I hear coming out of FedRAMP. So the way that they are approaching this is they're saying that FedRAMP, we are responsible for establishing standards, what a authorization package looks like, and that agencies are responsible for adopting what FedRAMP puts out for cloud services. And so right now, the agency playbook might be structured in a way that only supports Rev 5. Once we do see the consolidated rules, there will be an expectation that agencies also create a model for looking at 20x packages. And they may have additional overlay requirements that they want to see in addition to that. Hopefully it's not go do Rev 5, but ultimately they'll have an SOP around that as well. Again, it's something where I think we're too early in the process to make a clear determination on it. But Marc, I'll give you the opportunity.
I was going to say, I'll double down it's really early in the process. And this is it's Let's not pretend. It's a lot. It's a lot of different. And the government's great at change. A lot of. So this is definitely something that will save time for them to come on board. I mean, I heard Eat say a couple of different times that they have a certain responsibility for what is into the marketplace, but that as SKSs encounter resistance to working with FedRAMP, working with GoMB, and having them follow what is in FedRAMP law around accepting FedRAMP certifications as equivalent to what their NIST should be. So it's going to be a cultural change within agencies and how they evaluate ATO packages and how they evaluate the risks. And then also how we're having conversations. It's not, I'm sorry, not the exact answer I'm sure you were looking for, but right now we're kind of in that fluff and weekend. We're seeing how it's tied to.
What that means, like a buffer period where you have both a X and a Rev 5 package waiting for the government to change over?
It's a good question. It depends on your agency, which I know is a bad answer, but I'll tell you this from our perspective going through this. We went through the 20X moderate, which is now Class C pilot in January, finished it in March. Today we have 2 agencies that have purchased and are using our product, and both of them are doing it through our 20X and are kind of just figuring it out exactly what is needed and how this works as they go. We have other agencies that are talking to us right now who are evaluating and figuring that out for them as well. We even have an agency that would only need it at a Class D at a high level. And we're like, FedRAMP hasn't even put out the requirements for that. But they're like, well, we just want to start figuring this out because we want to be ready for that when that comes. So I think that the one thing that, it's true that change is slow and each agency is different. But the nice thing here is FedRAMP 20X is aligning the incentives such that agencies want to adopt it. Like, this isn't just motivation to help private companies get into the marketplace, it's also motivation to reduce the amount of work and burden on the agency to authorize and use a system. And so every agency we've talked to is excited about it, and they have different timelines of how quickly they plan to adopt it. But what we've seen is, like, if we look at 6 months ago when we hadn't even started our 20X, January we started, March we were listed, and then today we have 2 agencies using it. So I think this is going to move quickly, and I think now's the right time to start talking to those agencies about what their plans are.
All right, I do have a question down here. Yeah, thank you very much. Really insightful stuff. One thing I can't quite conceptualize here is the continuous certification, I guess you'd call it, authorization. When you're doing these KSIs, does the government have line of sight into your status at any point in time? And if that's the case, is there, does they fed into CSAM or some sort of, where is this going? This I have a good question. Second one is, Jordan, you covered a lot about the role of the 3K now called independent assessor. What you described though doesn't sound very independent, and is that going to be an issue with agencies as well? The advocate or coach versus an actual someone that's going to conduct an independent assessment and call out the risks. What you described sounds a little naughty.
I can start with the first one. I'll let Jordan answer the second one. So in terms of like, what does the agency have in terms of line of sight and visibility? So one of the requirements of FedRAMP 20X is to have a trust center. And so this is really replacing like connect.gov, CSAM, EMAS as a repository for where the agency would come to see your package. And so FedRAMP, today an agency goes to the FedRAMP marketplace and requests the FedRAMP package, and then FedRAMP is the one that'll send the stuff, or it'll go through ConnectGov or whatever. So in the FedRAMP 20X model, the CSP hosts their own package and makes stuff available through a trust center. And so the agency's coming there to access it. And so like if you... it depends on how you're doing it. Yeah, so like in Paramify, when we have an agency that is evaluating us or is authorized, we'll give them credentials so that they can come in and see the real-time evidence and the real-time validation. So it's kind of up to each CSP how they want to do it and what tooling they're using, but the goal is to give them what they need and sufficient, real-time evidence so they can make that decision. Now, Jordan, you want to answer the second one?
Gets a few more questions. But as far as the independence goes, FedRAMP doesn't have to check. So the level of independence this week to the independent assessor has always been a little bit blurred in terms of how that compensation model works. But again, like what we are doing is we're not actually providing the implementation advice. We might tell you recommendations that we think would help towards maturity. Whether an organization chooses to go implement those is up to them. And when we call out gaps, those gaps are the risks. And under 20X, there wasn't a discrete expectation that we categorize risk in the same way that we do under the Rev 5 model, where we're assigning an impact level and giving it a risk rating where it's low, mod, high, and those have their own remediation timelines. Because ultimately, the cloud service provider is maintaining some responsibility for how they manage vulnerabilities and risk. But at the end of the day, we're making sure that we are not providing any material advice that says, hey, you run this script and you give us this output, you will pass this control. Like, we'll never give you that type of advice unless we're your advisory partner. As the independent assessor, the recommendations are always geared towards maturity of saying, you'll have this all data coming in. Why are you not erring on that bulk data? What you then go and configure from a analytic perspective, get a bear.
Question about what? Well, question first about is federal customer data. So now there's a new definition out that it's all electronic information, content, and materials that an agency or its authorized users upload, store, or otherwise supply to a cloud service offering for processing or storage. This does not include account information, service metadata, analytics, telemetry, or other similar metadata. So this new federal customer data definition, how does that change the game for Rev 5 providers that have operated in a traditional boundary model? How does that change the game for how we need to be thinking about our boundaries, and also for a 3PO, how are you adjusting to doing assessments in that regard? And how does the trust center fit into that?
Yeah, I can touch on the first part. What we've been seeing is as we better understand the balance of TrueConnect requirements that are going to be coming out, or they are out, and applying them to Rev 5, you're really going to be evaluating that in an assessment scope and rethinking what your boundary traditionally has been, and then applying that new federal data definition to the medium assessment scope, and then applying the assessing moving forward to that.
And the information in the trust center were there. One could make an argument that that is not federal customer data, right?
Yep.
Due to
Yes.
heard that with you.
Yep.
Whereas the PMO had a hard line on that before. Vulnerability data, POAM data was in boundary, hard mandate, or full stop.
Yep.
Now we're going to be putting better high level boundary data up into a trust center that may not have FedRAMP Class D authorization. So where do we?
Yeah, when we, as a GRC tool, when we talked with FedRAMP, they're like, look, you guys aren't launching missiles. You probably won't ever need to be Class D. But then we talk to people and they're like, well, we need you to be FedRAMP High. So I think we're still figuring out exactly where those are. But there's likely that trust center could be outside the boundary in terms of the traditional sense.
We have one more question.
Yeah, sorry. As I'm gonna go back to your question, one of the reasons behind the machine readable requirements is that one thing that agencies were concerned about leaving connect.gov is that they would have to go visit everyone's different trust center, and it'd be a lot to manage. So making that KSI information available via API whenever it looks like, so that agencies can ingest KSI information into their own tool and see it as like a holistic view, because DHS may have like hundreds of packages, for example. That was sort of the end goal, that there's like this great GRC like community platform where like information flows, obviously in a controlled way, between the different tools, and different parties can see the things that they need to see.
Yeah, that's a good part, because there are some rules around programmatic access. And I've described it to a few of our clients that's around, you're essentially being this machine readable encyclopedia. As a cloud service provider, you're generating data, you're doing analysis, you're presenting that through your trust center. The agency can then go and pull that data programmatically and they can set up their own automation and alerting so that they only have to bring a human into the loop when they're getting some type of alert or notification on something that's relevant for them. So if Isaac is giving off his vuln information through his trust center and he's showing that failure, maybe one failure isn't a call for alarm, but if Isaac is failing that check consistently over the course of a week, at that point, the agency might have some type of automation built out where they say, okay, send that alert out to our human. Our human can go look into that. And ultimately, we have this life cycle of data and automation that's driven through these machine-readable outputs.
Yep. And so our most recent meeting with these two agencies that are using our 20x package was, how can we pull this into our Splunk so that we can set up alerting when you guys have incidents, when you guys have these failures, if we want to see that in our Splunk dashboard. And so that's kind of where we're at, of like moving to this continuous model. No, there's lots of other questions. I think we're just about at time here. So feel free to come up. I don't know, Marc, you probably know better what's next, but.
Yeah, I think we do have something else that's coming up next at 2:30. So if you do have a further question, you please feel free to track us down, hunt us down. We will be here for the next 2 days. We'll also be at the happy hour. So please feel free to help us as many FedRAMP points.
Yeah, come play some mini golf.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.